Good morning or afternoon, 8th grade. It is Monday, May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. We are going to be reading in 23.3 today in your 8th grade history book. We're going to be covering pages 376 to 379, learning about what happens after Ronald Reagan's presidency. This is known as a section known as In Reagan's Shadow. So let's begin. In the election of 1988, the American people overwhelmingly elected Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, over Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. Former Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana became the new vice president. President Bush promised to continue the direction that Ronald Reagan had begun. Let's look at some of his foreign policy. In the spring of 1989, university students in China challenged the communist regime. 1 million students and workers gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square in a great demonstration for freedom. To express their desire for freedom, the demonstrators erected a large replica of the Statue of Liberty. The world watched and waited to see how the Chinese government would respond, and respond they did. As many expected, the communists sent soldiers to crush the freedom demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. Many people were killed and others were jailed. Once again, the world was reminded of the cruel oppression of communism and what it would bring to a country. In fact, what happened is when the soldiers got there, the protesters wanted to leave peacefully or be put into a jail or be arrested. But they were boxed into the square and essentially were just run over by the tanks. And to add insult to injury, the families of these dead students were forced to pay for the soldiers' bullets and the fuel of the tanks that were used. For many years, China had received most favored nation trading status, meaning that the United States extended certain trading privileges to China in exchange for the same. But after the massacre in Beijing, Congress passed an amendment to withhold the most favored status from China. But President Bush believed that the best way to combat communism in China was through free trade. Thus, Bush continued to grant China this trading status in spite of congressional opposition, overlooking the communist tyranny and the violation of human rights by the Chinese government. So let's look at his foreign policy in Central America. In late 1989, President Bush ordered American troops into Panama. The unpopular dictator Manuel Noriega not only terrorized the people of Panama, but also smuggled illegal drugs into the United States. After American forces captured Noriega and brought him to the United States for trial, the people of Panama held elections for a new leader. By the early 1990s, the financial inability of the former Soviet Union to support communist terrorists led to a degree of peace and stability in Central America. Now let's look at South Africa. In the 1980s, the United States, along with other nations, imposed economic sanctions against South Africa to discourage a policy of apartheid, or a racial segregation that discriminated against blacks. Reform began when the South African government released Nelson Mandela from prison. Mandela, an outspoken leader against apartheid, came to the United States in the summer of 1990, thanking Americans for their support against apartheid and claiming to be a moderate socialist. However, Mandela was also a leader of the African National Congress that held close communist ties, but the news media continued to portray him as a hero. Finally, in 1991, South Africa abolished apartheid, and President Bush lifted economic sanctions, resuming trade with South Africa. And during this time, the collapse of the Soviet Union begins. The Iron Curtain is lifted. By 1989, the communists had lost control of Eastern Europe. Solidarity gained control of the Polish parliament in June. Hungary declared its independence in October, and Czechoslovakia rose up against the communists in November. East Germany also opened the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Millions of Berliners took to the streets to celebrate as young Germans beat sections of the wall down with sledgehammers. In December, Romania overthrew its communist dictator. East and West Germany reunited in October of 1990. By then, every Eastern European nation considered itself independent of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union had agreed to a limited troop withdrawal from Europe. Soon, Russia withdrew troops from Eastern Europe and the United States withdrew troops from Western Europe. In the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty signed in 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union also agreed to destroy some of their nuclear weapons. In May of 1990, Boris Yeltsin, a reformer, had become the president of the Russian Republic. By July, he had resigned from the Communist Party, fearful of losing its grip over the Russian people. The Communist Party attempted a military coup against Yeltsin in August of 1991. The coup failed, and by December of 1991, 11 of the former Soviet republics banded together to form the Commonwealth of Independent States. At this point, the Soviet Union fell to exist as a nation. Now let's learn about the Persian Gulf War. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq, invaded the tiny but oil-rich kingdom of Kuwait. Hussein planned to make all of the Arab nations surrounding the Persian Gulf servants to him. President Bush compared Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler. Both dictators were determined to conquer innocent people and steal their wealth. Europe and Japan feared Hussein because he threatened their supply of oil, while the other Arab nations and Israel feared that they would be the next victims of Hussein's aggression. After Israeli secret agents discovered that Hussein was close to developing an atomic bomb, President Bush convinced the United Nations to send troops to liberate Kuwait and to protect the other Arab nations. And this is known as Operation Desert Storm. As in past actions of the United Nations, the United States provided most of the military muscle. About 500,000 American troops, including Air Force and Navy units, had been shipped to Saudi Arabia to help liberate Kuwait by early 1991. Once President Bush obtained the support of Congress, Operation Desert Storm officially began. UN forces took the offensive and began round-the-clock bombings of Iraqi troop positions. New technologies, including highly accurate smart bombs and cruise missiles, enabled the Air Force to selectively destroy Hussein's targets without causing any civilian casualties. Bush insisted that the war in the Persian Gulf be directed by military men rather than politicians. He had read in history how the failings of Vietnam and Korea were mainly because Congress, not led by military generals, was the ones who were in charge of the war. He knew that soldiers knew better than politicians in how to fight and win a war. Thus, President Bush placed General Colin Powell in command of Operation Desert Storm. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Powell was second in military command only to the president. He now became the spokesman for the military, explaining to the American people exactly what UN forces were doing in the Middle East. At all times, he insisted on taking the offensive and pushing towards total victory rather than playing the wait-and-see game. For the first time since World War II, Congress followed the counsel of a military commander. Because General Powell had to remain in Washington, D.C., General Norman Schwarzkopf was appointed to lead the troops in actual combat. General Schwarzkopf inspired great devotion and bravery in his men. He kept the American public and the world aware of the daily events of the war through television briefings, beamed by satellite into every corner of the world. Unlike the Vietnam War, the Gulf War had the support of the American people. Patriotism and national unity in America were at their highest since World War II. On February 24, 1991, American, British, and French forces, assisted by Saudi and Egyptian forces, invaded Iraq. While Israeli forces stood ready to assist, the army of Iraq crumbled before General Schwarzkopf's brilliant moves on the battlefield. Thousands of Iraqi troops surrendered or fled the Allied advance. Within just a few days, Kuwait had been liberated and Saddam Hussein had retreated to a bunker in Baghdad. President Bush did not pursue Hussein any further because the primary objective, the liberation of Kuwait, had been achieved. Operation Desert Storm was a great triumph for the American military and the cause of freedom. The war lasted only 2.5 months, from January 16th to April 6, 1991, making it the shortest war our nation has ever fought. After the brilliant success of Operation Desert Storm, many Americans held Bush as a great leader. Now let's look at some of his domestic policies. In 1991, President Bush nominated federal judge Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court to replace the retiring Thurgood Marshall. Many liberals opposed the appointment of Thomas because of his conservative views. After much controversy, the Senate confirmed his appointment to the court. Although the United States was burdened with a staggering national debt, Congress continued to spend. In 1989, the national debt had totaled $3 trillion. By 1992, it was $4 trillion. Government spending was out of control because Congress refused to cut spending. Thinking that the collapse of the Soviet Union signaled a new world order for world peace, President Bush cut the defense budget, but did very little to help the national debt and threw many people out of work. To make matters worse, the savings and loan scandals cost the taxpayers $500 billion when careless speculation and illegal accounting procedures led to a number of bank failures and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was obligated to bail them out. Seeing no other alternative, President Bush finally agreed to raise taxes in order to keep the government from going further into debt. It soon became evident that the extra tax revenue would not be used to reduce the national debt because Congress still continued to increase government spending. President Bush sought re-election in 1992 on a platform of traditional values, free enterprise, patriotism, and a strong military defense. He also promised to lower taxes if re-elected. Democratic candidate William Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, and independent candidate Ross Perot, a billionaire from Texas, campaigned on an imaginary economic crisis. In reality, the economy was strong and healthy, but the liberal media helped Clinton and Perot create a climate of economic crisis, warning the American people that only a major change in leadership can save the nation from economic disaster. And this concludes today's lesson. Make sure that you've read it along with me also, and make sure that you do the section review on page 379, odd numbers only. Once you do that, you are done for the day, guys, and I will see you tomorrow.